Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar today. Was COP26 a success for rainforests? My name's Mark Grundy. I'm the Marketing and Communications Director of the Coalition for Rainforests. And in today's webinar, we're going to be reflecting on COP26. This was the climate summit in Glasgow, reflecting on the implications of COP26 for rainforests, but also looking at the road ahead in 2022 and at the next COP27. But before we begin the webinar, I just want to let everybody know if you have questions, we're taking questions. So please use the chat function. We're going to actually present the full webinar, and at the end of the webinar, then we'll be tackling all your questions and asking our guests to answer them. So please put the answers to your questions, please put the questions in the chat, and we'll be coming back to them at the end. So our webinar, it's my privilege today to introduce two incredible pioneers in the rainforest space, Federica Beata, the Managing Director of the Coalition for Rainforest Nations, and Kevin Conrad, the Executive Director of CFRN. Kevin and Fede have been working tirelessly on behalf of Rainforest Nations for over 20 years. And I use the word pioneers because they helped create and embed what is the only global conservation mechanism in the Paris Agreement, a huge feat. The conservation mechanism is called Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Degradation, or REDD+ for short. It's been successfully operating since 2005, and to date it has helped record over 9 billion tons of emissions generated by the world's rainforests. Why is that important? We're going to hear about that today. So I'm going to kick off with Kevin. So rainforests and climates, let's start there. Why are rainforests so vital to slowing the climate emergency?
Well, thanks, Mark. You've sort of got to look at forests from two lenses. So one side is, we all remember our basic classes with photosynthesis. Forests pull about 4 to 6 gigatons of carbon out of the atmosphere every year. They vacuum carbon out of the atmosphere. So we need them standing, we need them healthy. The other side is when we cut them down and they start to degrade, they put carbon up into the atmosphere. So we have to do two things as humans. We've got to stop cutting forests and allowing them to degrade, and we've got to keep that healthy forest vacuuming power moving. So McKinsey has done some graphs on the role of forests, and the message is clear that we can't limit temperatures to 1.5 degrees unless we have healthy forests and we slow deforestation. But as you can see from these scenarios here, they also have a lot of guesswork going on here. The very bottom line is CO2 removals, and they're relying very heavily on new technologies pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, something that forests do naturally. So again, this whole removal function, whether through forests or technology, are critical to 1.5 degrees, Mark.
That's great, Kevin. Thank you. And I know a lot of folks on the call today will be familiar with the Coalition for Rainforest Nations, will be familiar with our work, but just for those newcomers today, and I know we have a lot of very kind donors on the call today, could you just run through who the coalition is, first of all, and what we do?
Sure. So the coalition is a group of countries that, rather than blaming the wealthy world for putting carbon up into the atmosphere as they raced towards development, are voluntarily offering to reduce rates of deforestation and ensure the healthy forests in their countries as a solution to climate change. So we are the Secretariat. Our role is simply to support those countries in doing what they already know how to do. These developing countries are smart, they're effective, they know how to reduce rates of deforestation, and the role of the coalition is just to provide the capacity, support in order to scale that up to meet 1.5 degrees.
Thank you, Kevin. And I believe, you know, that there is a pretty compelling personal story about why you got involved here. Do you want to give us a little bit of background? You are Papuan. Why did you get involved in this? And what has been going on in the past 20 years that probably many sort of listeners are not aware of, without us spending the next hour to take that, of course, because 20 years is a long time. But what has been the journey like so far for you?
Well, I was blessed to grow up in the rainforest in Papua New Guinea. So this is something that is viscerally part of who I am. And I understand that destroying rainforests is hard. It's not an easy thing to do. So people destroy rainforests because they either want to sell the wood or they want to do something with the land. And so these are market failures that we as a global society have created. We're not paying for the ecosystem services of forests. We're not paying for that vacuuming effect of carbon out of the atmosphere. So about, I don't know, 15 or 16 years ago, the World Bank put Papua New Guinea on a blacklist for their logging industry. And the Prime Minister at that time, you can see a picture of him there, came to me and said, look, Kevin, I actually agree. I would love to keep my forests, but the North only pays for products that I produce as a nation when I destroy my forests. There's got to be a better way to do this. And so we began this journey and started working on paying developing countries for those ecosystem services that they provide to everybody. Forests in Papua New Guinea pull out carbon that comes from Europe, from the US, from Japan. And so how do we get developing countries fairly compensated for the work that their ecosystems do for all of us on Earth? Now, I thought this was an easy concept. So in 2004, I started developing a proposal to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, submitted it in 2015, thought this was such an easy issue that in probably 1 or 2 years, the world would understand it, that we could just get to work. It actually took us to about 2015 until we actually had a global agreement. But it's been a long journey, but it's been a productive journey. We've been very successful, and due to the excellent partners we have in all of our countries.
And Fede, you've been on that journey too, right from the beginning in 2004. I mean, how has that been for you? How have you experienced this progress on rainforests?
Hello, everyone, and Mark. Yeah, thanks for asking. I'm gonna be honest. Usually I am. I never thought that it was gonna take so long to create the mechanism that you know, we have now with the REDD Plus and the Paris Agreement. I was in banking at that time, where I was doing my MBA at Columbia Business School, London Business School, where I met Kevin doing his soul searching and how to give an economic value to the forest, so they were more valuable standing than chopped down. And I didn't know much about forest. My background was in banking, economic and finance, and I was blessed to be raised though in the Mediterranean forest of Italy. But besides that, I didn't know much about that, but I knew how to do due diligence and understand where were gaps, where there were gaps to be filled and they were not working. And so I decided to take a couple of years, at that time thought a break from my finance background to try to find the solutions for rainforest countries and how they could be more valuable standing and then chopped down. And Kevin said we were a little bit naive that in a couple of years we were solving the issue, and it took a little bit longer to really capture it into the Paris Agreement. But with great success and great satisfaction, that now all rainforest countries really have an opportunity, have an option to choose how to developing and decoupling development with environmental sustainability.
Thanks, Fede. And so far we've talked about rainforests in relation to their ability to sink and absorb carbon from the atmosphere, but rainforests are much more than that. Do you want to sort of give us an overview there? Obviously, these other benefits are not relevant to the Paris Agreement, but in many cases, they're probably more valuable to society.
Absolutely. And actually, I also am going to meet one more thing on my side. Why I decided at the beginning really to help Kevin on his quest and due diligence on how to give the economic value to rainforest, because I'm an animal lover and I wanted to be a vet initially, but I'm not really good with blood. And so it was not really a successful career for me to be a vet if I cannot deal with blood. But then when I saw this as an opportunity, and I say, wait a moment, if I can save the last rainforest, I can save the house of all the animals where they're living. And we know that more than 70% of the animals and the plants, they're really at the moment in the rainforest. And so I couldn't miss this opportunity really to give, to make my try to do this for the animal of the world. But at the same time, I also learn, there are more than 1 billion of people, they're forest dependent. Their livelihoods depends from the forest. And so while saving the forest, we help, just billion of people that they are depending from that. We also saw, as Kevin said, that we cannot achieve the climate goal of 1.5, the Paris Agreement goal, without saving the last rainforests and reversing the deforestation. They're so important also for soil health. And we saw, they're helping with the degradation of the land. They're helping with the desertification, to avoid the desertification. And the Sir David Attenborough, he said is on his documentary, we need to rewild the earth, and that means we need to allow the forest to grow back, because in that way we have a chance really to save the world and to save all the human and living being there in there. They're so important also for the water. They give us the water that we can live without food for some time, for a few days. We cannot definitely without water, and also medications are coming from the forest. So it goes just more beyond than the climate goal, and because forest is so much more.
Thank you. So critical for people, critical for the planet, and critical in our fight to slow the climate emergency. Wonderful. Let's go back to the organization. For those people who have only just heard about the Coalition for Rainforest Nations, can we talk a little bit about sort of what you do on the day-to-day and what your teams do, what type of support you give? Or NGOs do different things. So again, back to you, sort of Fede, on what is the sort of daily work of the coalition? Who do you work with, and what are you trying to do?
Absolutely. As we started through the policy work, helping the country to understand the issues that they were facing in their countries, and how policy, institutional arrangement could be created inside the country for them to better value and better protect the environment. At the same time, we assist them, the policy internationally, to make sure that any agreement, like for example, exactly the Paris Agreement, could be included, the voice of the developing countries, and not mostly be excluded like it happened with the Kyoto Protocol. So we really switched that, and this is continuing. We were just coming back from Glasgow, where we will see a little bit what was achieved and what are the next. And so this policy support and coordination is still very important. Though we realized that when the REDD+ mechanism was created in 2015, we would have a big tiger paper that is great, but it would have not been working if countries were not able to implement it. And so we really start supporting them at the technical level with experts going into the countries and help them to implement in the 26-27 UNFCCC decision. And so measuring their greenhouse gas emission, preparing greenhouse gas inventory, submitted exactly with the format requested by the UNFCCC into the decision, etc. And so we have teams that they go there. The past couple of years, due to COVID, we haven't been traveling as much, of course, but we quickly developed at virtual training for which we have been very successful, and we're very proud of our countries that engage from every part of the world. And at the same time, so since we started, at the moment there are 9 gigatons of reduction that have been produced by rainforest countries through the REDD+ mechanism. The problem is about only 5% of those reductions have been paid for. And so we're really trying also to develop tools where actually countries can have direct access to finance, and we will talk a little bit more through this webinar later.
Great, thank you, Fede. So let's move on now to the main topic of the webinar today, to the Glasgow Climate Summit, which finished just over a month ago. There was a huge amount of expectation for COP26. It was postponed a year. We had the COVID pandemic. And so when we came into COP26, this was hosted by the UK presidency, there was eyes from across the world on this. COP26 finished. We all read the newspapers. We saw there were potentially successes on the fossil fuel side, with agreements on methane, on agreements on fossil fuel subsidies, etc. But we didn't read a lot about rainforests. So that, on the webinar today, we want to hone in on, was COP26 a success for rainforests, and what were the details that maybe the journalists missed, that you, as part of the sort of coalition and as a party to the COP, experienced. So first of all, I'm going to hand over to Kevin. Kevin, what's your reflection now the dust has settled after a month? What do you think were the wins and losses for rainforests?
Well, Mark, thanks. These COPs are very complex meetings. You've got 192 countries. They're all pushing for, one, a global outcome, but at the same time, they're trying to reflect their national interests to make sure they can implement. They have to do, nationally determined contributions that contribute to the ultimate goal. It's about implementation. So we had a agreement on forests. This was sort of the first day or two. It was a commitment by a large group of countries to end global deforestation by 2030. So from a political standpoint, that was an important messaging, or is important for signaling. Unfortunately, for someone like me, this is the third time we've done this. We did this in 2009, we did it again in 2014, and here we are in 2021 saying the same thing. Now, this time there was about $16 billion of money pledged, which sounds like a lot of money, but I'll get into that a little more later. There was also some success on tightening the limits around emissions. So countries resubmitted their nationally determined contributions. They were added up, and they look a little bit better and closer to 1.5 degrees. But clearly more action is needed on that. Then the big outcome was for Article 6. Now, what does Article 6 do? The sixth article of the Paris Agreement is about market-based instruments and bringing in the private sector and allowing for countries that reduce emissions to share some of those reductions with countries that are struggling to reduce theirs. And so we had a rule book that was achieved there, and that was actually an important thing because it's taken us 5 years to get that rule book completed. Now, while there are always some achievements, there are some things that aren't so great. So while I talked about 16 billion being pledged for rainforests, according to several analyses, we need closer to 100 billion per year. So not a one-time payment of 16 billion or a fund of 16 billion, but we need year in, year out about $100 billion a year. So while a pledge is great, if it doesn't have the sort of finance behind it to make it effective, it brings into question the pledge itself. As I highlighted earlier, some of the commitments were not aligned to 1.5. Japan, for example, has an NDC which is 10 years in duration. We need to be having shorter NDCs, tightening the belt more often and more aggressively. But again, this is an iterative process. There were some unfortunate inclusions and exclusions. So sadly, the British government caved to the wealthy and the rich countries and left, candidly speaking, Africa, the small island states, and the least developed countries out in the cold. So commitments on adaptation were largely missed. We wanted some signaling on rainforests, so we wanted to make sure there was appropriate signaling in Article 6. The United States blocked that on the last day, unfortunately. At the same time, they allowed in credits from the previous treaty, which was the Kyoto Protocol, really from China, India, Brazil. And what you notice with those countries is that their emissions have gone up, and they allowed old credits into the new regime from countries where emissions had gone up, showing that actually the CDM was totally ineffective, but they transferred those credits forward. And a country like Papua New Guinea that under the Paris Agreement reduced its emissions significantly under the REDD+ mechanism was excluded. So the wealthy got what they wanted. The poor countries who had actually reduced emissions were left out. At the same time, some commitments on reducing reliance on coal were excluded. So those are some of the what I call frustrations that came out of COP26, and there were quite a number of decisions that are pushed onto COP27, Mark.
Great. I just want to unpack a lot of these points here, Kevin, because some of this is extremely complex. Let's go back to these numbers, better known as climate finance. You said that we need $100 billion a year to save the world's tropical rainforests. So why, how does that work? What's the sort of opportunity cost? What is this money? If we get a pot of money of $100 billion, why is it $100 billion? How do you get to that number, first of all?
Well, we rely on two studies, and more work needs to be done on this. But there's been one study that estimated about $70 billion a year is needed if you focus purely on stopping deforestation in isolation. There have been other studies that have estimated you need about $340 billion a year, and that's when you include all of the agricultural sort of drivers of deforestation and how you would maintain food security. So when we say 100 billion, it's probably more than that. It's probably somewhere closer to 200 billion. But in our mind, 100 billion gets you started. There's a lot of lower opportunity costs that we can begin on today. And as we scale up and get further into sort of the economic drivers, it's probably going to cost more and more over time. So those numbers came from two independent studies that I'd be happy to share with anyone who's interested.
Great, thank you. And then you just used the word opportunity cost. So
yes.
I assume that these monies will be used to pay communities to do one thing instead of another. Can you just elaborate how this works on the countryside?
Certainly. The notion is that if a country is making money through the global economy for something that is bad for climate, should they stop that, fire everyone, and have to absorb all those costs if they're a developing country? Or should they be supported to find a sustainable livelihood for all of those people? So you start with the costs that you would forego if you stopped an economic activity that is destroying forests, and replace it then with a livelihood that actually supports the forest. So we look at how much money is a country making from logging, for example. How much money is a country making from cattle ranching that is destroying rainforests? And then the idea is to value the rainforest more than they are making from those economic drivers. That's the only way you allow a poor country to develop and pull itself out of poverty, it's not by telling it all the things not to do, it's by creating better options and alternatives for its economic growth.
Great. Basically, so if I've understood this correctly, let's take Papua New Guinea as an example. Papua New Guinea would be able to put a moratorium on concessions for logging and concessions for commercial agriculture because they no longer need the money from those private sector companies. They will be receiving them as climate finance instead. Is that how it works?
Well, that's the only way we think it will work and last over decades. If you just put a fence and a chain around the rainforest and say don't touch it, the evidence is that poor people will always go into the rainforest and in order to survive. So if you want them to value the rainforest, you have to give value to that rainforest. It has to be more valuable alive than how current market failures only value it when it's dead. And so it's about reframing our economic constructs and valuing ecosystem services and paying those communities that are in those ecosystems to protect the rainforest rather than we currently pay them to destroy them.
Great, thank you very much. That's fascinating. The final bullet, key decisions and actions punted to COP27. I think for many people outside of this sort of COP process, first of all, they're sort of getting their head around this sort of huge global meeting. I think for many, people thought this is a one-off. So to hear that there is a COP27, and I'm guessing another 25 COPs behind it is also quite confusing. So when you say actions and decisions are punted to COP27, so basically, although you didn't get what you wanted for rainforest, there is another chance. Is that what we're suggesting here? And tell us a little bit about COP27 if that's the case.
Yeah, exactly, Mark. In order for a global agreement to work, it needs to be constantly updated and tweaked to be more efficient and more fit for purpose. So that's happened in climate. We started the Kyoto Protocol. There were a series of weaknesses in the Kyoto Protocol. It left most developing countries out from obligation. The Paris Agreement has come in. It's now everyone is involved, but yet we've got to constantly improve. So every year the countries will get together, take a look at what has been achieved, and work on tightening up the system. So it's natural that certain issues, if you can't agree on them in 1 year, you will circle back and address them the next year. And that's what happens. So you can argue that the focus of COP26 was to get this Article 6 rule book complete. Okay, great. And then you can argue, well, some of these other issues that were less important in that framing should be discussed later. So we see that as the role of forests. We'll be back in COP27 in Africa, talking about the Congo Basin, talking about resilience, highlighting how the Congo Basin protects weather, stops desertification. It actually impacts weather for Europe. There's a whole series of resilience lenses that forests can be viewed from, and those are the kind of things we'll be talking about at COP27.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. So I think we can move on to COP27 now. Move on to the next slide. So Kevin, you've highlighted a little bit of what to expect there. Again, these are 2-week meetings every November where 192 governments sit down for 2 weeks, discuss, negotiate, and we come out with an outcome. I'm guessing it's not all done in those 2 weeks. So can you sort of give us an idea of what will go into next year as a whole? Maybe Fede, what will CFRM be doing from January 2022 to get ready for COP27 and to put rainforests in a better position?
Absolutely. A lot of work with our countries is already going. We never stop, after Glasgow. But before I get into that briefly, maybe I know for the people that we have, probably they are very familiar with what the COP is. We have been talking about COP. Maybe we just put it in few words. So the COP is simply the Convention of the Parties. And what does it mean? The Convention of the Parties to what? Is to the Convention. The Convention has been adopted in 1992 at the Earth Summit in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, and was then ratified in 1994. Was ratified by 196 parties. And then the first COP, Conference of the Party, which is the final decision making of the convention, it took place in 1995 in Berlin. Why Berlin? Because Germany is the host, is the headquarters of the UNFCCC Secretariat. And the Conference of the Party, the COP, now we can say, everybody knows here, what is it now, meets once a year. And usually is in Germany, unless there is a country hosting it. And actually, since 1995, there has been always a country nation hosting this COP. And so it travels the COP based on the country that is the host, and that country is also at the presidency of the COP. And so this year was exactly the UK for COP26. COP27 will travel to Africa, will travel to Egypt, and UK will give the baton to the Egyptian presidency on the first day of the COP. So as a CFRN, we will be working in preparing policy, as Kevin was saying, to make sure that certain elements that were left behind in Glasgow, because not everything can be achieved in one COP, will be taken place and will be taken and get the attention that they need, that they deserve in the COP27. At the same time, we will also spend time in educating everyone, and make awareness of the 9 gigatons that have been produced of RED+ under the UNFCCC. Unfortunately, companies or individuals, etc., know quite little about that. And so we will continue to show to the world all the effort and the achievement that have been achieved by rainforest countries under the Paris Agreement to the RED+ mechanism. Our technical team will continue to support our countries with the capacity building on producing greenhouse gas inventories, reference levels, technical annex, that means how they present the results, either of their reduction or conservation or increase of carbon stocks. And we will hopefully start traveling again, COVID allowing us to do that. So looks like it's a very intense period. And of course, we will also work on the financial tools through the RED+ platform, and also through the capital and market initiative that we are leading with some partners like EY and together with other countries. So looks like quite interesting and busy year for the CFRN and all rainforest countries, and we are excited about that.
That's great, Fede. That's great. Again, coming back to climate finance, because I think that's where people find it the most difficult to understand. This sort of, Kevin talked originally about the number, the realistic number, that if we're going to make a dent into deforestation, what we need to do in the next decade. As part of CFRN's work, you talk about carbon credits and this brand called Red Dot Plus, and you also talk about a debt fund. Can you just unpack that a little bit on each of those? Let's talk about the sort of carbon credits and how does that work, and then how does the debt fund work? You mentioned that you're going to get financial partners, but how does the mechanism of that work so people understand what's happening?
Absolutely. There are two part to that. We need to make these asset created liquid for people that want to become carbon neutral, carbon negative, corporations and individuals, so they can support rainforest. They have done their job in the reduction of emission, increase of carbon stock, on conserving their forest. And so the supply is there. The developing country, the rainforest country, have done their work. But most of the world doesn't know about that. And so through the Red Dot Plus platform, CFRN made available for the rainforest countries a registry where they can simply upload the credits reviewed under the UNFCCC for the world to be purchased. This is important thanks actually to the Article 6. There's not going to be a double counting, double selling exactly to the registry that is the base of the platform. And so this is very important, an important piece. We need to work also to make sure that the countries get paid for the right price. And so we were talking before about the opportunity cost. And so clearly, $5 or even $10, we saw in many countries the opportunity cost is closer to $25 to $50 because we are facing drivers like palm oil, cattle ranching, etc. And so it's very important that the price goes higher for country really be able to choose keep the forest, not put in the cattle ranching or the palm oil. And so we will be working really to make sure that the price needs to be the right price and has to be Paris compliant with the 1.5 agreement. At the same time, while those credits can be sold, the countries also need support to provide further credits and to make sure that this reduction of increase of carbon stocks, of conservation, is continuing year after year. And so they need some upfront financing, like for example, when country produce coffee or cocoa. So you need to have some advanced funding. So you buy your seed, you plant your seed, and then you will be able to go to market and sell it. And so we're working with the capital market to make sure that there is also this fund to provide the initial funding to get the seeds, to buy the seeds, to planting and getting going. And we saw that there is really a lot of interest and willingness by the capital market to be involved on this. And so we are quite excited at what is coming up.
Great, thank you very much. That's very, very insightful. So just a reminder to everybody, we are getting to the section in the webinar where we'd love to hear from you. So again, use the chat button, put your questions in here. Let's have a quick look what we've got coming in. We have one already from Eduardo. So Eduardo asks, GCF has not got the $100 billion target. How do you expect rainforest nations could get this exclusive $100 billion to save the world's forests? What could be the strategy? And GCF, if you wouldn't mind explaining any acronyms there as well, please, for everybody's sake. So thank you, Eduardo. So I'll throw that out to Kevin or Fede.
Sure, I'll jump in. The world in 2009, Gordon Brown actually was the one who proposed this, was $100 billion a year for climate finance for all sectors. Now, there wasn't much analysis behind that. Gordon sort of thought it was a big number and pulled it out of the air. One of the unfortunate outcomes also of COP26 was, since 2009, we still have not reached $100 billion a year for climate finance. Now, the question is, how do you get even that number for forests alone? And in that sense, we think there are sort of two key things that have to occur. One is we need better messaging. We need to start talking and educating people about the role of forest. People have to understand that saving forests is something we can do now. We don't have to wait for a new technology. This technology of how to plant a tree is well known. This technology of how a tree pulls carbon out of the atmosphere has been happening since before humans. So we know what to do. We've got to reverse global deforestation. We have the machine in place that's able to do it, and we need more people to understand the power of forests and the power of the REDD+ mechanism under the Paris Agreement. That's one bucket. The second bucket is that we've got about 35 gigatons of emissions coming from fossil fuels every year. It's going to be very hard to reduce those emissions totally as fast as is required. So we need companies to pursue becoming carbon neutral by first doing their best to reduce the emissions that they can in their own business models. But secondly, to become carbon neutral, they can buy credits from developing countries and from forest countries for the emission reductions that they're achieving and the removals that they're achieving. So through this partnership of those that emit and those that reduce and remove, we can actually guide our planet gently down to a sort of a carbon neutral reality in the future. And that's where the money has to come from. It's got to come from companies, cities, and individuals who are interested to become carbon neutral or carbon negative in their life as quickly as possible. In order to do that, making payments to developing countries who are reducing and removing carbon on behalf of all of us.
Great, thank you, Kevin. And Eduardo has got back with a follow-up here. Just a follow-up question. I'm just going to read it out. A big turndown at COP26, I'm guessing the big disappointment, was the exclusion of carbon credits, REDD+ carbon credits from before 2020. So basically carbon reductions that had happened before 2020. So it sounds like they were excluded in the text. It says CFRN has worked hard to prepare Rainforest to get these results. What are your expectations or options to reward or monetize those carbon reductions that are not included in the Paris Agreement moving forward? What are the ideas, if that is?
Can I get this one?
I would say Eduardo's on fire with his questions today. Thanks, Eduardo.
Can I get this one, Kevin?
Go ahead.
Yes, that's one of the, I would say, not positive or more negative element of the results of COP26. Unfortunately, also not in the disparity that we had with CDM, Clean Develop Mechanism, that actually is a mechanism that doesn't exist anymore. It belongs to the Kyoto Protocol, which expired in 2017. But credits coming from those mechanisms got included from 2013, while credits coming from forest, which is Article 5 of the Paris Agreement, so is exactly the agreement that we're talking on, etc., have been currently excluded, and so they're saying can be included from 2021. And so CFRN countries, CFRN has said from the beginning of the COP actually that we need to achieve the 1.5, and therefore none of the credits pre-2021 should be included into the future, because the reduction need to be real, need to be part of the NDC, then all connected. And so that were our statement from the beginning. However, we also said that if CDM, that is not even part of Paris Agreement, we're gonna get included, REDD+ should have been included with the same token. Unfortunately, one got included, the other did not get included. Our strategy is to keep working on it, towards Egypt. Is not in lost, but also the other things is to try to secure public finance for those early actions, we call it, for these pre-2020 reduction that have been achieved by the credit. So nothing is lost. We have, different avenues that we already start working, and we will continue to work to make sure that countries that, did so much effort and made those reductions for us will be incentivized.
Great, thank you, Fede. So we've got another question coming in from Lisa. Thank you, Lisa. I'm conscious for the most of this webinar, we've been talking about the United Nations, about something called the REDD+ mechanism, reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. This is a mechanism, but we haven't really talked about the sort of on the ground and how this works. So Lisa is asking, what efforts are there to embrace and to foster forest restoration within the coalition? How does that work?
Yeah, there's, I guess, two perspectives on this. The first thing you need to understand is that it's far more important to save a tree than it is to plant a tree. It takes a long time for trees to reach maturity, and a mature tree basically protects so many of the endemic species that tree plantations don't. So always focus on saving trees before planting trees. However, having said that, restoring existing forests is also an important piece of the puzzle. That areas that have been degraded close to existing forests tend to recover fairly quickly and tend to have the genetic and biodiversity, well, the diversity that's necessary to protect habitats, etc. So focusing on rehabilitating forest areas and lands are important and are an important part of the future, but it's much more important to save the trees we have and to focus on stopping deforestation than it is on planting trees. This is a conversation I had with Bill Gates recently. I was talking to Bill about trees, and he said, listen, the carbon stays up in the atmosphere 10,000 years. Who's going to be babysitting these new trees you planted for the next 10,000 years? Because that's what needs to happen. Now, his follow-up statement was, but those forests that have already been here for 10,000 years, we need to protect them, continuing to do what they do. And we've just got to realize that protecting standing forests is so critically important to what we do.
Great, thank you, Kevin. So moving on, we have a question from Robin Anker Peterson. I think this goes back to the climate finance topic. It says, how are you able to work with investors, say fund managers of pension schemes in the City of London or New York? How are you able to work with investors on rainforests?
Fede, do you want to? I don't want to monopolize it. I think you should take that one, or I'm happy to jump in.
Okay, let me start, and then if you have anything to add. Thank you so much for your question, Robin. I mean, it's very important, and we think that we are now ready to start a discussion with investors and with fund managers in London, in New York, and any part of the world, as we are developing our Rainforest Global Fund. Where the idea is really to have investors that, as I was talking earlier, of the seeding fund, seeding money that needs to provide to countries. So we start reaching out actually fund managers to do that, because with the Article 5, with the further clarification, the Article 6, the REDD+ mechanism is really getting mature for that. And so we start reaching out to those constituency stakeholders, and if you know where to find us, if you guys have ideas, etc., of some that we should be engaging and maybe we have not reached out, please help us to do that.
Great, thank you, Fede. I think we've got one more question here. So if you do have any more questions out there, please put them in. We're going to probably do this question and then one more final question after this. So this is from Wayne. It's not a COP26 question. It says, CFRN has grown in profile to donors, including through the effective altruism movement. So how has increased donor support and philanthropic support helped you to grow your capacity as an organization? So a bit of an internal question there. How are donors, the generosity of donors, how are their funds being used to enhance the capacity and improve the impact and the effectiveness of CFRN?
Well, I'll jump in on this quickly, and Fede, feel free to add. What the coalition does as a secretariat is we're in service to all of the countries that are members. So the more money we have, the more team members that we can send in country to help them with the whole exercise of conserving forests. So we have a big program on measuring, monitoring, and verifying using satellite imagery and ground truthing how the forests are being managed. We can do that in more countries. We also are working with countries on policy and legal issues. It's one thing to say you need to conserve your rainforest, but do you have the laws in place to make it happen? Do you have the laws in place to manage the companies that are causing deforestation? That's an effort. The larger our team, the more effective we can be on that. But I do have to say one thing. The goal of the CFRN is to put ourselves out of business through success. It's clear that our developing countries can do this. We're just trying to help them get started and help them move faster. But sooner or later, the world is going to know how to do this. It's going to happen. We're going to make it work. And hopefully the CFRN is no longer relevant. But where we sit today, there still is a lot of work yet to be done.
Yeah, if I may briefly add to Kevin on this one, the additional funding really help us also to assist country in additional questions that came from them that we wouldn't be able to do otherwise. For example, the creation of national trust fund. If they start selling credits, what do they do with the money? They want to make sure that the revenue distribution is right. And so in cooperation with EY, we are working on a pilot, in creating national trust fund, and also to make sure that there is a revenue distribution to the community, to the final holders, of the forest, to the people that are acting on the ground and make sure. And so this is a new set of elements that we're doing that we're very proud also thanks to the additional funding and effective altruism. Last but not least, we are also able to provide tools that if country would have to secure them individually, like for example, a national registry, will be very expensive and difficult to produce. And so thanks to that, we were able to produce it for them and donate it to them free of charge. And so get them moving through the Paris Agreement decisions and steps that they need to take to be able to implement it.
Great, thank you very much, Fede. I'm good. There is no final question, so I'm going to sort of throw in a final question and bring you guys back to slide 1 today and the complex McKinsey graph about the importance of deforestation. Looking back over the past decade, we've heard a lot of great news about renewable energy, about electric vehicles. 10 years ago, there weren't as many Teslas on the road. People didn't have as much solar panels. We've heard a great deal about the energy transition side of the climate solution, and hopefully things will keep moving faster and faster and we'll get off oil and gas. Deforestation, we didn't hear, and conservation, we didn't hear anything a lot in the past 10 years, but people are saying this nature-based solutions to the climate emergency, this is going to be their decade. This is going to be the most critical climate solution we need to solve. We need to work this out. For people listening to this webinar, what can they do? They can't, we can put solar panels on the roof, we can buy an EV, but when it comes to saving rainforests, tropical rainforests outside the country you live in, what can people do today to help you, to help the rainforest? Give us an idea of how they can engage, please.
Well, let me start by saying, because you started with the McKinsey graph, and if we can take it back there, it just disappeared in front of us. McKinsey makes this, if you look at the dark blue line in there that sort of begins with 6, that means 6 gigatons of emissions that are coming from the loss of forest. McKinsey makes this huge assumption that by 2030, we're going to cut that by 2/3. And we have to cut it by 2/3 if we're going to stay on 1.5 degree pathway. So Mark, that gets directly to your question. How do we do it? And the answer is we have the machine that is working. The REDD+ mechanism under the Paris Agreement is reducing emissions at a gigaton scale. The problem is that not enough people know about it. and that there's not enough finance behind to speed it up. I sort of imagine it like a Ferrari. It can go really, really fast if it has fuel. But the fact of the matter is there isn't enough fuel yet in the REDD+ mechanism to achieve what we really need, which is to reverse global deforestation. Not only do we have to stop it, but back to one of the other questions, we've got to rehabilitate lost lands and lost forests. We've got to convert fields that are fallow and make sure that they're removing carbon. There's so much work we've got to do. It's not only about stopping deforestation, about reversing it. And so that's where groups like ours, and there are others, that are working with countries to provide the right kind of economic incentives. That's the key, Mark. It's about economic incentives. You can't just tell poor people, don't do this. They need to feed their children. Their kids need to go to school. You know, they have so many requirements, and we can't just tell them, don't touch your assets for the good of all of us. We have to provide them alternative livelihoods that are sustainable. And that's the whole key to the success.
That's great, Kevin. So the REDD+ mechanism is our answer, and we must support it. Governments, the private sector must support this. That's wonderful. Thank you. Okay, well, I think we're going to be wrapping up now. So thank you to everybody who watched this today. Thank you very much for your questions. And just the sort of the final wrap up here, if you want to learn more about what we're doing and our progress as we move into 2022 towards COP27, you can sign up for the newsletter. You can, if you want to learn more about what we've been doing in the past 2 or 3 years, you can check our annual reports. There's a lot of great information and case studies there. And then finally, thanks as always for any donations you've made to us. You know, we appreciate your generosity. We couldn't be here if it wasn't for your generosity. So you'd like to make more online donations, go to rainforestcoalition.org. You'll find a donate button there. And if you do want to talk more, Aaron Rasper, who's our development director, is always willing to get on the phone and chat about where the monies go, how effective we are in using that, and he'd love to speak with you. So thanks, everybody. I want to say thank you again for Kevin and Fede for taking their time today to sort of give us that sort of inside look on COP26. And hopefully we'll be doing more of these webinars next year as we sort of move forward into the year and get ready for COP26. So thanks for your time and have a lovely holiday. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.